Great. Well, good morning. Good to be with you. Just encourage you, as I always do, just to press that share button if you can. Remember, probably on average about 30 extra people will connect in some way with what God is doing this morning if you press the share. Well, as Matt said, today is the last in our sort of 4-week Advent series, a series we entitled Good News is Coming. And we've looked over the last weeks at 4 prophecies, or flash forwards, as Mike referred to them, from the book of Isaiah, given by the prophet Isaiah 700 years before Christ came. And they were promises that good news, promises from God that good news was coming. Good news that ultimately came at Christmas in the form of Jesus Christ. So Mike looked with us at Isaiah chapter 9 in a message entitled A Time of Peace, the Great Light. I then looked with us at Isaiah 35, A Time of Refreshment, the Great Outpouring. And last week, Claire looked with us at Isaiah 42, A Time of Renewal, the Great Servant. So I'm going to finish this morning by looking at Isaiah 61, verses 1 to 3, in a message entitled A Time of Favour, the Great Exchange. Well, how many times have you found yourself offered a great exchange, made an offer that feels like some really, really good news? So many years ago, when the timeshare industry was at its height, I was offered a great exchange. Give us an hour and a half of your time, sit through a presentation on our holiday apartments, and whether you invest in an apartment or not, in exchange for your time, we will give you one of the following 3 things. A Mercedes sports car, brand new, £50,000 in cash, or a speedboat complete with trailer. So I dutifully sat there through an hour and a half of presentation and then went to collect my reward afterwards to discover, yes, I had got the speedboat, which turned out to be a small rubber dinghy with just enough room for 2 people, powered by a 12-volt battery motor that lasted 15 minutes, and you had to pay £150 to have it shipped from the United States to the United Kingdom. Well, there are 2 types of exchanges I'd like to suggest to you this morning. Those exchanges that are just too good to be true, and those exchanges which are too good to be missed. My timeshare exchange clearly fell into the category of too good to be true. Which type of exchange it is often determined by the nature and the motives of the one offering the exchange. So doubtless behind the timeshare exchange were some unscrupulous, money-making, just want to sell to you and make a profit people. Well, that isn't the nature of the one behind the offer of the great exchange in Isaiah 61. As Claire reminded us last week from Isaiah 42 on the great servant, the one behind this good news is someone who won't break a bruised reed, won't snuff out a smouldering wick, who takes us by the hand and restores us in our brokenness, and is prepared to do that at great personal cost to himself. So as good as this offer is in Isaiah 61, and we'll see just how good as I unpack it through the message this morning, as good as it is, we can be assured that this offer of a great exchange falls into the category of too good to be missed. Just a bit of background from Isaiah 61. Isaiah 61 is clearly a prophecy about the coming Messiah, a prophecy about the coming of Jesus, and the good news that he was going to bring with him, the opportunity of a great and amazing exchange. And we know this is about Jesus and what he will do because of what Luke records happening in chapter 4 of his gospel when Jesus visited Nazareth. Let's read that from Luke chapter 4, verses 14 or 16 to 21. He, that is Jesus, went to Nazareth where he had been brought up. And on the Sabbath day he went into the synagogue as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of the sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour." He was reading from Isaiah 61. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, "Today, this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." So Isaiah has an incredible flash forward 700 years previously to a day of favour, to a great exchange. And 700 years later in Nazareth, Jesus has a flash back as he opens the Bible and reads from Isaiah 61 and says, "Today in me, that day of favour has come. That great exchange is made possible." And that's why Christmas is so passionately celebrated by us as Christians, because Christ's coming heralded the beginning of a most incredible time of grace and favour, heralded a door of opportunity opening to participate in a most remarkable exchange. So, who benefits from this day of favour, this great exchange? Well, it's on offer to everyone, so all can benefit, but it tends to be a select group that do benefit. So all can, but only some do. And Isaiah identifies that select group in verse 1. Let's read that verse. "The Spirit of the Sovereign Lord is on me, because the Lord has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners." So the select group, when it comes to this time of favour, to this great exchange, are the poor, the broken, the captives, those imprisoned by darkness. And the reason it finds them out as a group is very simple. This time of favour involves exchange. And a favourable exchange, yes, but nevertheless an exchange, which means you have to let go of what you have to take hold of what God has and offers you. You can't participate in this exchange without letting go of what you have. Jesus in Matthew 5 talked about the poor in spirit. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The poor that the good news is preached to and received by are not just the materially poor, though it most certainly includes them. It's the poor in spirit. So if you're poor in spirit, you're not self-satisfied and proud. You're dissatisfied and humble enough to acknowledge your dissatisfaction and your need. Jesus often talked about meeting the needs of the hungry and the thirsty. It's a similar theme. It's not those that have, it's those that don't have, that are far more ready to exchange what they do and don't have for what God is offering. So my father knew about this great exchange for many years. He himself was not a Christian, but he heard about it through me over the years, many times. But he never engaged with it because he was always self-satisfied and really too proud to admit any needs. He valued what he had too much to want to exchange it until he was in the last couple of days of his life. Then what he had left in his life seemed less attractive and enduring, less worth holding on to. So he decided to make the exchange and wonderfully exchanged what he had for what Christ was offering to him, as Abby and Linda led him through to Christ a couple of days before his death. But it didn't happen until he recognized his poverty. Was it last minute? Yes, it was very last minute, but just as legitimate an exchange as a thief on the cross made with Jesus in the last hours of his life. This good news, this great exchange gets proclaimed to the poor, the broken, the captives, not because it's preached in a discriminatory manner, but because the poor, broken, and the captives are predisposed to hear it and predisposed to letting go and exchanging what they have. So if you're self-satisfied, content, and wanting to keep hold of what you have, this good news, this day of favour, this great exchange will likely pass you by. But if you're hungry, if you're thirsty, if you recognise your poverty, and if you know you're chained and held captive in some way, and in some way, shape or form broken, then good news is coming. Great favour, blessing, and opportunity to participate in an incredible exchange. So what does Isaiah foresee in chapter 61 as the ingredients of this great exchange? What's on offer? What makes it an offer that's too good to be missed? Well, he foresees an exchange that allows us to trade in, if you like, to trade in three things. The first thing it allows us to trade in is our ruin for his riches. Isaiah 61 verse 3, Jesus said he was anointed to bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. Here's the great exchange. Our ashes for a crown of beauty, our mourning for joy, our despair for a garment of praise. Of course, ashes in the Old Testament are symbolic of ruin. You know, if your house burns down, the only thing you're left with is a pile of ashes. In the Old Testament, if people went about in sackcloth and ashes, they were expressing a sense of ruin and were communicating their grief, despair, and regret at that ruin. So Isaiah is foreseeing a time when people can exchange their ruin, their ashes, for the most incredible array of God-given riches. Now, I'm sure that you, like me, have thoroughly enjoyed the baptismal stories that have been shown to us and we've heard over our sort of November Sunday services. In all four stories throughout that month, we heard how people were able to trade in their old broken lives that were without hope and without God for new lives filled with hope and filled with God. People were excited as they traded in lives dominated by sin, guilt, regret, fear, and powerlessness for lives in which they came to know God's forgiveness, God's righteousness, and the power and motivation needed to live their lives for God. And as we listened to the four that got baptized, to John Brodie, Paul Douglas, Sarah Parsons, and Chris Ong, we heard time and time again the sound of Isaiah 61 and Luke 4. We heard time and time again stories of mourning giving way to joy, despair giving way to praise, ashes giving way to crowns of beauty. And we celebrated with them as they got baptized. And if you haven't seen any of those stories, they're still, or you can watch them on our Facebook page. I think they might be on our YouTube and website as well. But do listen to those stories because they are Isaiah 61 absolutely being fulfilled. In the great exchange with and through Jesus, our ruin gets traded in for God's riches. Secondly, in the great exchange of Isaiah 61, we get to trade in our captivity for his freedom. Isaiah 61 our captivity for his freedom. Isaiah 61 verse 1. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim freedom for the captives and release from darkness for the prisoners. Here's the great exchange: our captivity as prisoners in darkness for God's freedom and release. You know, if anyone had said to me before I was a Christian, you're a prisoner in captivity, trapped in darkness, I would have called them a religious nutter, totally out of touch with real life. I would have said to them, hey, look at me. You know, no criminal record, no bars or restrictions on my life. I'm completely free to make what choices I want when I want. But that perspective would have totally changed in the year before I became a Christian, because 12 months prior to giving my life to Christ, for no reason at all, I started to experience deep dissatisfaction with the person that I was. In particular, I started to see how self-centered and selfish I was in much of my decision-making and in many of my choices. I made a decision that year to try to make better choices, to think of others, to do the right things I knew I should be doing. In fact, to do the right things I wanted to do. But I failed miserably that year. In fact, I did some even worse things that year than I'd ever done previously. I came to the conclusion at the end of that year of trying, I concluded I was trapped, a prisoner to my own self-centered, immoral desires, unable to break free and to be the person I wanted to be. But all of that changed a few months later. It changed at the point of great exchange, when I realized who Christ was and what he'd done for me and invited him into my life to take charge. And at that point, with Christ in me, I became like a different person, suddenly motivated and empowered to make the right choices, to say no to selfish, godless desires and yes to pleasing God. It was remarkable. It was like stepping out of prison, stepping out of darkness into a newfound freedom. The freedom to be the person deep down inside I knew God had created me to be. And that journey out of captivity into God's freedom didn't come to an end after an initial burst of enthusiasm on my part. It's continued for the past 40 years I've been walking with Christ. In fact, here's the amazing thing. That journey has increasingly brought me into new and deeper realms of freedom. So the initial years were in my journey. They were a journey in which God brought me free from some of the more obvious things in my life I was trapped by: pornography, immorality, anger, violence, wrong use of drugs and alcohol, coarse language, lying and cheating. I could do all of those things like falling off a log before I was saved. Then there were years after God sorting those things out, of God setting me free from wrong attitudes and wrong reactions and responses and wrong thoughts, and increasing my love and my heart for him and for people. Now, I'm not suggesting all those things nor my attitudes that everything's sorted out, but the last 15 years for me of walking with Christ have really been about God setting me free from what I call wrong internal drivers. Those things deep down inside that we're often not consciously aware of, but they are things that can wrongly drive us in terms of wrongly driving our motivation, behavior, responses, and reactions. So over the last years, God's been working on setting me free from finding my value in the wrong places, in my performance or in people's appreciation of me, and finding it in the right places, in Christ and in God's love. God's been working on setting me free from the need to be in control or the fear of what people think. He's also been setting me free from the need to fix everything for everyone. The list of my insecurities and my wrong internal drivers could go on and on and on and on. They really could. But the point that I'm making this morning is this: my experience of walking with God is an experience of an incredible exchange, an exchange of captivity for freedom, which, if we're prepared, in an ongoing way to be a disciple and follower of Christ and respond to the prompts of the Holy Spirit is a freedom that just gets deeper and richer with every passing year. A freedom that enables us to fully be the person we were created to be increasingly secure in God's love, and to reflect more and more to others Christ-likeness. The great exchange of captivity for freedom prophesied by Isaiah in chapter 61 and brought about in and through Christ is not simply a one-off opportunity and choice, it's a daily opportunity and a daily choice. So many people fail to understand that and only live in a fraction of the freedom that they could enjoy through this great exchange of captivity for freedom. Finally, the great exchange, in the great exchange, we get to trade in what I've called our modesty for His splendour. By modesty, by the way, I mean ordinariness would be a way of describing the modesty I'm talking about. Isaiah 64 or even 61, verse 3 says they, and I've put in brackets the poor, the broken, the captives and the prisoners because it's referring back to verse 1. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of His splendour. You know, Linda, my wife, spent the vast majority of her childhood in and out of the care system. It was not an easy childhood. Relationships, education, trust were all very difficult things for her. So her own description of herself out of that was that she was a can't do rather than a can do person. She lacked a huge amount of confidence. She felt extremely inadequate. And she completely lacked any expectation or aspiration for her future, because in her own words, she never expected to achieve or amount to anything very much. That was her own words. It was Linda's 61st birthday last week. So people write in the cards and they say nice things to you as they do on your birthday. We also listened to some of the speeches given at her 60th birthday party the year before. So people were recalling, whether it was through cards or through the speeches, who Linda was to them and what she brought into their lives. So inevitably, as you do at these times of celebration, you reflect on your life and what God has done in you and through you, and you use it as an opportunity to give thanks to God. So if I was to summarize what God has done in and through Linda's life, through what others say about her, this verse in Isaiah 61 would describe it perfectly. He has taken a modest, ordinary, have-not woman who never expected to amount to much or to achieve much, and He's planted her in the soil of His love and grace and grown her into a most magnificent, mighty oak to reflect and display His splendour. I typed into the internet as I was preparing this message, what is special about an oak tree? And the first thing that came up was this: the oak tree is one of the most loved trees in the world, and with good reason. It's a symbol of strength, morale, resistance, and knowledge. Well, that would describe perfectly who and what Linda is to me, to her children, to her family, to our leadership team, and to others in the church and outside of the church as well. They would describe her as a source of strength, an inspirer of morale, a source of wisdom, and someone who lives and communicates unbending resistance when it comes to God's ways and righteousness. One of the most loved trees in our family and in our church. Of course, I'm a little bit biased at this point, so you'll need to forgive me for that. But that is what God specializes in doing. taking the modest, the ordinary, the have-nots and the can-nots, and planting them in the soil of his love and grace, and bringing forth from those lives oaks of righteousness, plantings of the Lord, lives that display God's strength and splendour, because only God could take that which is so modest and ordinary and grow it into something so mighty and splendour. And the story of what God has done in and through Linda's life could be repeated again and again and again and again in the lives of so many people in our church and so many people across the world that know Christ, because it's part of that great exchange that Isaiah prophesied about, the ability to trade in our modesty and ordinariness for God's oak-like strength and splendour. So in conclusion, hey, good news is coming this Christmas. A day of favour, the opportunity to make a great exchange. Not a too good to be true exchange, a too good to be missed exchange. A day of favour and opportunity made available to everyone, but likely to find out only those willing to make the exchange, willing to give up what they have. The poor in spirit, the brokenhearted, the captives, the prisoners. If that's you this morning, then be encouraged, because through Jesus, you can make some incredible trade-ins. You can trade in your ruin for God's riches, your captivity for God's freedom, and your modesty, your ordinariness for God's splendour and strength. God bless you.